I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's my colleague for some 26 years, and he's Matthew Jones. He's a fantastic colleague to work with, and Matthew's going to talk to you about the service we have at Alder. Matthew, you're very welcome.
Good morning, Paul. Morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. My talk is called Specialisation in Esophageal Atresia, which I think we can summarise as saying which surgeons should be looking after children with TOFS. And as you can see from that slide, this is a very controversial topic, which is going to make me a few enemies. But I should say it's totally a personal viewpoint. This is not an official position, it's a personal viewpoint. But it's the viewpoint of someone who's coming towards the end of his career. So I perhaps could not be accused of having a vested interest in what I'm about to propose. So when I qualified in medicine 35 years ago, there was such a thing as general surgery, which was genuinely that. It was surgeons who did just about everything. That idea has long passed into history, and there really isn't such a thing anymore. In almost every branch of surgery, people have specialised. And in adult surgery, it is now the case that surgeons can only do certain procedures if they do a certain number every year. So, for example, if you were a surgeon who wanted to do thyroidectomies, take out the thyroid gland, you're expected now to do 50 a year. And this is a trend which is totally accepted in adult surgery, all of which brings us to paediatric surgery, where things are a bit different. The issue with paediatric surgery is that children fall ill much less often than adults, and they have a very wide range of problems. And so it is fairly unlikely that any paediatric surgeon is going to have experience of huge numbers of any one condition. And you could argue, and people do argue, that in paediatric surgery, our expertise is in the management of problems of a particular scale rather than problems of a particular organ. And that is a fairly good argument, and the truth is that many of the skills that we have are translatable. So if you're good at doing one particular condition in paediatric surgery, it's quite likely that you'll be good at doing another. However, it is fair to say that this attitude has generally not been accepted in adult surgery. And one of the reasons we've all been attracted to paediatric surgery as paediatric surgeons is that it is so general. We like the children, and children are lovely to look after. They're obviously much nicer to look after than very elderly people with multiple problems. But we also, just as surgeons, we like the fact that we do lots of different things. Our surgery is interesting because you never quite know what you're going to do next. And so there is a huge reluctance within paediatric surgery to accept that even for conditions as serious as esophageal atresia, there might need to be some specialisation. So I'm just going to give you some facts and figures about TOFS and paediatric surgeons in general. I'm going to let you make up your own minds about where you think we are and what you think we should do about it. I have some views of my own, but again, they're personal views. They're not official positions. So this is a cartogram of Britain, which is basically a map adjusted for population. And the red dots are all the centres where TOFS get repaired, and I think there are 27 of them or something, but you can see that they're not very evenly distributed around the country, and you can see that some dots, I'm going to be kind to Manchester there. Manchester has a huge area around it that it serves, but at the other end of the scale, you can see there's loads of places fighting over things in London. The centres are very unevenly distributed around the country. in terms of the population, and also obviously geographically. You know, we've got Aberdeen up here. Well, it doesn't look as if it's serving many people, but of course it's miles from anywhere. So, you know, if you don't have a service in Aberdeen, you've got a long way to go to get it. Now, you might think for a condition like esophageal atresia that there would be fabulous data saying how many patients have it and what the results are and things. But I have to tell you that in medicine generally, the national data is not good. This is a situation that's stretched back for decades and decades. There are national databases, but they're basically based on coding, which goes to do with the financing of the NHS. Only certain things are coded. The coding is a bit crude. It's fairly unsophisticated. Complications and outcomes are not necessarily coded, and they're not necessarily linked to the procedure which caused it. This data here for 2008-2009 is probably the best data we have for esophageal atresia, because on that year, the British Association of Pediatric Surgeons set out to get the data from every centre. Now, there are other data sources, and things are improving. The government is making a big effort to improve the data collection. But this is the best year we've got, and it appears that in that year, there were 126 cases of TOF in that year. My own instinct, and I think most of my colleagues feel that's probably an underestimate, they probably missed a few. But the figure's not going to be far wrong. And that's 5 cases per centre per year, which is not a lot. But it's worse than that, because this is how it broke down for the centres in Britain. And I only know which centre we were. I'm Alder Hey, by the way. I work at Alder Hey. Sorry, I should have made that clear. That was Alder Hey in that particular year. What you can see looking at that is that more than half of all TOF repairs were done in only 5 centres. And you can see that there's quite a large number of centres that had very, very small numbers indeed. There are 190 paediatric surgeons in Britain. You can do the maths. If every paediatric surgeon did a TOF equally split amongst them, you would get 1 TOF repair coming up every 2 years. In fact, the way the numbers break down because of the centres, there will be surgeons who do a TOF repair less than once every 2 years. There are others who'll do it quite a bit more. What I haven't included in these numbers is the fact that we all have trainees. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but trainees, by which these are fully qualified doctors, these are doctors who are in training who are yet to become a consultant. They have to be trained in what they do, and they have to be trained in operations like this. We all have trainees. Every time a TOF comes to theatre, you will have a trainee at the table, and senior trainees will expect to be given these operations to do. In fact, they are mandated by the Royal Colleges to do a certain number of these. They're actually, as things stand at the moment, mandated to do a number which is impossible to achieve. But that's how things work. So the numbers that I gave you for consultants doing it, you then have to add to the fact that there is a similar, if not greater, number of trainees also expecting to be doing it as well. And they will be doing it because they have to. And we are obliged as trainers to let them do it. So I think you can get the impression that there are a lot of people doing very, very, very few TOFs. Whenever you challenge surgeons about it, they come up with lots and lots of arguments about why the situation is okay and why it should continue. And you hear all these arguments. I'm not going to read through them. Actually, there's a lot of truth in all of that. I mean, it is true that you can have a very, very good surgeon who won't do a TOF very often, and they'll get a very nice result, even if they do once every couple of years. It is true. This is true. Unfortunately, we have no statistics to show whether or not the outcomes are great. The statistics don't exist. So let's look at the sort of outcomes that do get recorded and that people do claim show that things are all right as they are. Before I go into the individual things, I come back to this point that the national data is extremely unreliable. If centres look at their own data and their own outcomes, mostly it relies on people trawling back through case notes, half of whose pages have been lost. The whole thing's utterly chaotic. As hospitals move towards an electronic record, the data probably gets better, although my experience of electronic records is that they're pretty fallible, to be honest. But the data that you would think is there to show that things are okay just isn't there. This isn't just a British problem, actually. I should point out that actually data collection in Britain is probably amongst the best in the world because we have a national health service that collects data on a national basis. Other countries are actually well behind us on this, but the data you would expect exists doesn't really exist. So the outcome measure that everyone says is mortality and survival. This is, how many of your TOFs survive having the condition. And people routinely say, well, our outcomes are great. We haven't had a TOF death for ages, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, I have no idea what other people's TOF tests are. I happen to know what mine are because for the purpose of this talk, I went and found out. And this is my TOF survival data over a period recorded on Alder electronic record system. And the point about it is, as you can see, that all the TOFs who didn't survive died of something else. Mortality is a really bad outcome measure for esophageal atresia because by and large children don't die of esophageal atresia, they die of something else. So just because a centre tells you that nobody's died of esophageal atresia in 3 years doesn't mean it's good. You wouldn't expect them to. It's just not a good outcome measure. But it's probably the only reliable outcome measure that could be got from the national data. Another outcome measure that I think we would all accept that an anastomotic leak is a complication. But the problem is we have no idea what the national leak rate is because there is no code on the data collection systems nationally for a leak. A leak only appears if the leak results in a surgical intervention. And even then, it's not necessarily the case that the national data system would link the intervention to the leak. And if you don't look for a leak, and a lot of people don't look for leaks, and the leak is managed with antibiotics and a bit of rest, you won't even know if you've had it. So to be honest, leak would be quite a good thing if the data was reliable, but the data isn't terribly reliable. And here's another thing about leaks. There's lots and lots of papers out there about minimally invasive esophageal atresia repair. Almost without exception, they suggest that the leak rate for minimally invasive surgery is higher than the leak rate for open surgery. But in that context, it seems to be regarded as an acceptable complication. Perhaps it is acceptable. I don't know. It's just that as a complication, as a measurable measure of outcomes, it just doesn't seem to work. Here's another one. We do know how many TOFs have balloon dilatations because, you balloon when you have a stricture. Lots of your families and children will have had balloons. If you have a stricture, that's undoubtedly a complication, and having a balloon is a coded procedure, so we know how many of these get done. But the reality is that a lot of centres have quite aggressive ballooning policies. We at Alder balloon a lot of children because I quite like children to swallow without any dysphagia. Have a fairly normal eating, so if they don't do that, I'll balloon them. I have a very low threshold for doing it. Ballooning is actually a very simple and straightforward procedure. Is it a measure of outcome for esophageal atresia? I'm not sure that it is. Paul wrote a paper there. Sorry, I missed it. Paul wrote this paper a few years back. This was Alder data on balloons. And you can see you can do huge numbers of these with no particular problem. So it's not really a complication, having a balloon. You all know what the real outcome measures are for esophageal atresia. It's your child having a normal life, isn't it? Yeah? It's having a normal life, basically. Eating normally, not being troubled by loads of chest infections. This just isn't collected. This data doesn't exist. I'm going to fly the flag for our own TOF service here. When I began as a consultant at Alder back in the 1990s, one of my now retired colleagues set up the Multidisciplinary Esophageal Atresia Clinic service, which was a joint service run with the respiratory physicians, dietitians, and physiotherapists. because he and the respiratory physicians recognized that there was this enormous pool of patients who were basically esophageal atresia cripples. They had such terrible chests, such terrible eating problems, that their lives were just ruined by this. And I think this service, which my predecessors set up, has totally transformed the care of TOFS at Alder. We try to adopt a very proactive, aggressive approach to the treatment of children with esophageal atresia. And over the course of my career at Alder, I'm absolutely confident that the overall outcomes we have achieved have improved hugely in terms of the quality of life of our patients. So getting a really good outcome is not just about the surgeon who does your operation at the beginning. It is actually about the quality of the follow-up, the degree of ongoing medical input you get throughout your life, throughout your childhood, and about the sort of breadth of expertise and experience that is available to you in a kind of one-stop point where you can get help. And I'm absolutely certain from 20 plus years of working in this clinic and this service that is the difference in outcomes. And I'm absolutely sure that our children from Alder in general have outcomes which would stand up very well to comparison with many other centres. And it's not because of the surgery, it's because of the total service and the total weight of experience in one centre. I'll tell you an anecdotal story. Am I running out of time, by the way? I've got time. Am I okay for time? Okay. When I first began at Alder, I actually was appointed as a liver surgeon because there was a condition, a very serious condition called biliary atresia, which presented in small babies and which required an operation early in life. It was a condition that had terrible outcomes. A lot of the children died. A lot of them went to liver transplantation. And at the time I was appointed, biliary atresia was being operated on in the majority of paediatric centres in Britain. But very shortly after I was appointed, the parents group, along with the big liver centres in Birmingham and King's, kicked up an absolute stink about this condition, and they said, it's really outrageous that this is being managed in loads of places. It should be managed in a small number of places. I happen to think they went about it very badly. It was done in a way which provoked a lot of anger and fury, and claims were made about surgeons in other centres that really didn't stand up to analysis. But now, biliary atresia is treated in only 3 centres in the UK. Nobody would go back to how it was. Nobody would go back. There's no question of doubt that even if the claims they made at the time were wrong, the care of children with this condition now is so much better than it was, just because if you have this condition and you go to Birmingham, you're surrounded by people who know it and understand it, and you get the best possible care that you can get for it. Actually, the outcome is still awful. Most of these children still end up with a liver transplant. But here's the thing, they get the liver transplant in the centre which they're being seen in. They don't have to go to other hospitals. It's all done in the one place. And I can't help but feel that with a condition like esophageal atresia, and the mere fact that we have a room full of people tells you this isn't a condition that's wonderful, you know, we haven't solved all the problems with this condition. I can't help but feel that there ought to be some sensible rationalisation of the treatment of this condition and the care of this condition. One of our approaches at Alder, which we adopted very soon after I started, was to reduce the number of surgeons who treated this condition. We have 14 paediatric surgeons, roughly, don't we, at Alder, Paul? And we decided fairly early on that we were going to limit the numbers of people who did this operation. And this just shows you how it's run over the years. And you can see that mostly there's been 3 people doing it. And here's a sort of succession of new surgeons coming in as old ones are falling off. But basically, if you look at this, you can see that each of the surgeons on this chart, they're getting a steady exposure to children with esophageal atresia. So in terms of their numbers, they're all getting decent numbers. These are very good numbers nationally. Not only that, they're doing it in the circumstance of being surrounded by an experienced team where they're being mentored by surgeons who've done very large numbers, where they're surrounded by chest physicians who see children with this condition all the time. One of the other things is, if you do concentrate expertise in a small number of centres, you actually get some experience of the even rarer stuff that flows from esophageal atresia. So if you think esophageal atresia is rare, having an esophageal replacement is even rarer. Having the, cervical H fistula, oh, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. This thing, where am I? See, there we are. This is what's called a cervical H TOF. These account for 5% of all esophageal atresia. So, you're looking at a very, very rare condition. Concentrating expertise in one centre means that you have surgeons who've done a few of these. I think I've probably repaired 12 of those in my career. That's not very many, actually, but Ed Kiley in the front row here, who's probably the most experienced esophageal atresia surgeon I know, will tell you that if you've done 12 H fistulas, that's quite a lot by national standards. There'll be plenty of surgeons out there who've never done any. And these other things, these are all rare. Aortopexy, this operation here, I suspect a few of you have experience of this. This is a rare operation, Same true of everything on the list. And here's the other thing. How do we train the next generation of surgeons to do this condition? If they're rotating through centres that see 1 or 2 TOFs a year, they'll have 5 trainees in that centre. How on earth are they going to get the exposure if there isn't some concentration of expertise, if there isn't some streamlining of trainees to do this surgery and to get experience in this surgery, if this is going to be their interest as a surgeon during their life? Why are we asking surgeons who are training to be paediatric urologists to get numbers of esophageal atresia when they're never going to do it? I mean, we know the numbers just don't add up. There just aren't enough of them. And here's another consideration. I don't need to tell you what this is about, but if this is really more for my talk when I give this talk to surgeons. If you appear in court with an esophageal atresia problem on your hands and a patient suing you, what's the first question you're going to be asked? How many of these have you done? I don't want to pretend, though, that specialising this is a cost-free option. If you do specialise and you reduce the number of centres doing this, this means people are going to have to travel. That's inconvenient. There's a cost that you pay in terms of de-skilling the local services. I know this from other things. I know this from the biliary atresia problem that I mentioned before. Now if we see a patient who's a Merseyside patient with biliary atresia, they come into Alder with a problem. We're like, I don't know anything about this, I mean, we do our best, but we've lost our experience. And that is a problem if you de-skill the periphery. I have my own ideas about the way to go. I think there is a halfway house to be had, which is that there is some reduction in the number of centres that do this, and that within these centres there should be a specialisation of this service within a smaller number of surgeons, that it should be properly structured, where there is proper mentoring of the younger surgeons by the older ones, where there is ideally 2 consultant operating, where from a trainee's point of view, you'll get exposure of this in terms of seeing it and maybe helping with it as a trainee, but you'll only really get to do this when this is your chosen specialty area and you'll do it within a mentored system. I think also, there has to be a proper multidisciplinary service. If you're going to do this, there has to be a proper multidisciplinary service with multidisciplinary clinics. And I think also at the bottom here, I put, there really needs to be a much better national database of what's going on. The national data just isn't good enough. It really isn't good enough. It isn't good enough anywhere in the world, but we have an opportunity in this country with the NHS and a very centralised system to establish a proper database and get some decent outcomes so that at least we will be able to know who is doing things well and who isn't, because at the moment we really don't. And I think that's it. Thank you.